What does it look like when the machines that build a nation also destroy the city they are running in? I went looking for the answer in the Pittsburgh survey of 1907, in the photographs held at the Carnegie Museum of Art, in the sootfall measurements that Pittsburgh's Bureau of Smoke Regulation collected ward by ward across the city for decades. And what I found was not a metaphor. It was a number. Fatal accidents in the steel mills accounted for 20% of all male deaths in Pittsburgh in the 1880s. 1 in 5 men who died in the city died inside a mill. The Economist reported that the newspaper lists of men killed and wounded each year were as long as a casualty list from a war. The mills did not pause between casualties. The furnaces did not shut down for funerals. The machines kept running because Andrew Carnegie's business model required them to run continuously, day and night, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, and every hour they ran, they produced steel and smoke and profit and dead men in roughly equal proportion. By 1900, Carnegie Steel produced more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. 40,000 tons of coal were burned per day in the Pittsburgh district alone. The smoke from those fires turned the sky so dark that the city ran its streetlights at 10 in the morning. A journalist named James Parton visited in 1868, looked down at the valley from the surrounding hills, and described what he saw in the Atlantic Monthly. The town lies low, as at the bottom of an excavation, just visible through the mingled smoke and mist, and every object in it is black. Smoke, smoke, smoke. Everywhere. Smoke. It was, he wrote, like looking over into hell with the lid taken off. The British philosopher Herbert Spencer visited Pittsburgh in the 1880s and said afterward that 6 months' residence there would justify suicide. He was not joking. He was describing a city that had the highest typhoid death rate of any major American city, the highest rates of pneumonia and tuberculosis in the industrial Northeast, and smoke so thick and so constant that it had altered the daily behavior of every person who lived there. Retailers stopped displaying goods in their windows because the soot ruined the merchandise before it could be sold. They covered displays with glass screens or simply kept everything behind the counter. People wore dark clothes, not because they preferred them, but because light colors showed the grime within hours. Housewives used washable paints on their walls because wallpaper turned black within weeks. A 1924 account described walking the streets of the Strip District at noon and needing a lamp to see your way. Air pollution levels in Pittsburgh during the peak of steel production were, according to NASA researchers who studied the historical soot fall data, roughly twice as high as a bad air day in modern Beijing, which is currently one of the most polluted cities in the world. Pittsburgh, in the Gilded Age, was the most polluted city in the industrialized world. That pollution existed because the region was producing more steel than any other place on Earth. The machines that produced this were not a single device, they were a system, a chain of enormous interconnected machines that began with raw coal at one end and produced finished steel products at the other, consuming ore and limestone and water and men at every stage, running 24 hours a day in a cycle that could not be interrupted without destroying the equipment itself. A blast furnace that is allowed to cool cracks apart from the inside. The thermal stresses fracture the fire brick lining. The iron that has solidified inside the hearth cannot be removed. The furnace must be torn down and rebuilt from scratch at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of lost production. That is why the machines ran continuously. That is why the men worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. The machines could not stop. The men were inside the machines, and so the men could not stop. The first machine in the chain was the coke oven, bituminous coal from the hills surrounding Pittsburgh, some of the richest deposits on the eastern seaboard, was loaded into banks of narrow brick ovens called beehive ovens and baked at high temperature for approximately 48 hours with limited oxygen. The process drove off the volatile gases, the moisture and the sulfur, leaving behind a porous, high-carbon fuel called coke that burned hotter and cleaner than raw coal. Coke was the essential fuel for the blast furnace. Without it, no blast furnace could reach the temperatures needed to smelt iron ore into liquid iron. The coke ovens were the foundation of the entire system, and the men who worked them, called coke drawers and levelers, did their work in radiant heat that came off the oven mouths in waves you could see with your bare eyes, pulling red-hot coke from the ovens with long iron rakes, loading it onto rail cars while it was still glowing, their clothing soaked with sweat and blackened with coal dust within minutes of starting the shift. The coke went to the blast furnace. Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, built in 1875 and named after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad who had given Carnegie his first big contract, had 11 blast furnace stacks by the turn of the century. The Carey furnaces in Rankin had 5. The Lucy furnaces in Pittsburgh had 2. Each furnace was roughly 100 feet tall, lined with fire brick, charged from the top with alternating layers of coke, iron ore, and limestone by skip cars that ran up inclined tracks to the furnace throat and dumped their loads into the roaring interior. Hot air at over 1,000 degrees was blown in through tuyères at the base, igniting the coke, which burned at temperatures exceeding 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The iron ore melted. The limestone absorbed the impurities, forming a floating layer of slag that was drawn off separately. And at the bottom of the furnace, every 6 to 8 hours, the tap hole was opened and liquid pig iron poured out in a stream of white-hot metal at roughly 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The men on the casting floor directed the flow. They built sand dams and channels to guide the molten iron into molds called pigs. They worked with long iron tools, standing inches from liquid metal that could ignite cotton clothing from 6 feet away by radiant heat alone. The air above the casting floor shimmered. Sparks flew from the stream when it contacted moisture in the sand. If a sand dam broke, if a mold was wet, if the stream splashed, the liquid iron went where gravity took it, and the men in its path went with it. A man caught in a splash of pig iron at 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit did not receive a burn. He received the kind of injury this channel has described before at Butler, at the ladle explosion. He was converted. The casting floor was the first place in the machine chain where the product of the system could kill a man by touching him. It would not be the last. From the blast furnace, the pig iron went to the converter or the open hearth furnace. If you have watched the Bessemer converter video on this channel, you know what the converter did. A 20-minute blow of atmospheric air through molten iron burned out the carbon, producing steel at speeds and prices that had been impossible before Carnegie adopted the process in the 1870s. But by the 1890s, the open hearth furnace was replacing the Bessemer for most applications. Carnegie's Homestead Works, across the Monongahela River from Braddock, operated 16 open hearth furnaces by the turn of the century, each one producing 40 tons of steel every 6 hours. The open hearth was slower than the Bessemer, but produced cleaner, more uniform steel. It ran at nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The waste gases from the molten charge were recycled through the furnace to generate additional heat, passing through regenerative chambers of fire brick that stored the energy and released it back into the process in alternating cycles. The efficiency was extraordinary. The temperature was extraordinary. The men who worked the open hearth floor worked in conditions that were extraordinary in the original sense of the word, meaning outside of ordinary human experience. The first helper, the man who directed the operation of each furnace, stood at the furnace door and judged the condition of the melt by looking at the molten metal inside. He looked into a bath of liquid steel at 3,000 degrees. Over time, the ultraviolet radiation from the melt damaged the corneas, producing a condition called furnace cataracts, a progressive clouding of the lens that left older steelworkers partially blind. The second and third helpers worked behind him, managing the charging machine that fed raw materials into the furnace, controlling the flow of fuel, gas, and air, monitoring the temperature, and preparing for the tap. When the steel was ready, the furnace was tapped, and the liquid steel poured into ladles that were carried by overhead cranes to the casting pit, or directly to the rolling mill. Every step of the process involved men working in proximity to liquid steel. Every step involved heat, noise, speed, and the physical possibility that the next second would be the one when something went wrong and the metal went where it was not supposed to go. From the furnace, the steel went to the rolling mill. Massive steel ingots, still glowing red from the heat of the melt, were run through trains of paired steel rollers that squeezed and shaped the metal into rails, beams, plate, rod, sheet, and wire. The rolling mills were among the most dangerous departments in the plant. The ingots moved at speed through the roller trains, guided by men with long tongs who had to catch, flip, and position the metal between passes with split-second timing. A mishandled ingot could kick sideways off the rollers and strike a man dead before he could step back. The rollers themselves were exposed. A man who caught his hand between the rollers lost the hand. A man who caught his arm lost the arm. A man who was pulled in did not come out. A visitor to Homestead in 1894, writing for McClure's magazine, described the scene. Wild shouts resounded amid the rumbling of an overhead train. The furnaces boiled in a flurry of sparks. At every moment, the men did what seemed impossible. They handled bars of hot steel without touching them. This was the machine system. Coke ovens, blast furnaces, converters, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, each one feeding the next, each one running continuously, each one consuming coal and producing heat and smoke and steel and injury and death. Together they produced more steel than any industrial operation in the history of the world, and they did it in a single river valley in western Pennsylvania, where the smoke from their fires darkened the sky at noon, and the men who ran them worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a single holiday per year, the 4th of July. Carnegie gave them the 4th of July. The rest of the year belonged to the machines. If your family worked in the mills, the coke ovens, the rolling mills, the blast furnaces, if your grandfather came home with burns he never talked about, or hands that did not work the way they used to, if there is a name in a parish record in Braddock or Homestead or Rankin or Munhall that you have always wondered about, subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The 12-hour day was the foundation of the Carnegie labor system. Every department in a Carnegie mill that ran continuously, which was most of them, divided the 24-hour day into 2 shifts. The day turn ran from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening. The night turn ran from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. The men alternated between the two on a weekly basis. But every other Sunday, the shift change required what the workers called the turnaround. The man coming off the day turn on Saturday evening did not go home. He stayed at the mill. He worked through Saturday night. He worked through Sunday morning. He worked through Sunday afternoon. He worked through Sunday evening. 24 hours on his feet, in the heat, in the noise, feeding the machine that could not be turned off. Then he went home. He slept. He had earned a single day off, his only day off in 2 weeks. The following Sunday, he was back on the regular 12. The turnaround was not overtime. It was not an emergency measure. It was the standard schedule. It was the rhythm of the machine applied to the human body. And it continued until 1923, 22 years after Carnegie sold his empire and retired to Scotland. When sustained public pressure and the threat of federal legislation finally forced U.S. Steel to adopt the 8-hour day. Margaret Byington, one of the 6 researchers in the Pittsburgh survey of 1907 and 1908, the most comprehensive study of industrial working conditions in American history, studied the household life of working-class families in Homestead. She documented what the 12-hour day and the 7-day week and the turnaround meant for the people who lived inside that schedule. She described families where the father was effectively absent from the household, sleeping during daylight hours after the night turn, leaving for work before the children were awake, returning after they were asleep. She described wives who managed every aspect of domestic life alone because the mill had taken the man who was supposed to share it. She described the boarders, the extra men who rented rooms in family homes because the housing in Homestead was insufficient for the population the mills demanded. Families took in 2, 3, sometimes 4 boarders to supplement the household income, and the wife cooked for them all, washed for them all, kept the house for them all, in addition to raising the children, managing the money, and waiting for the mill to give her husband back. John Fitch, another Pittsburgh survey researcher, published The Steel Workers in 1910, focusing on the men themselves, their conditions, their attitudes, their injuries, their relationship to the machines that consumed their days. Crystal Eastman, in Work Accidents and the Law, documented the dead and the maimed, 526 industrial deaths in the Pittsburgh area in a single year. 45 one-legged men, 100 cripples walking with crutch or cane, 30 with an empty sleeve, 20 with but one hand, 60 with half a hand gone, 70 one-eyed men. Her sentence has stayed with me since the first time I read it, and it stays with me now. It is no wonder that, to a stranger, Pittsburgh's streets are sad. The men who worked the Carnegie mills had tried once to change the system by force. On July 6, 1892, at Homestead, the most advanced and most productive steelworks in the world, 3,800 workers went on strike after Carnegie's chairman Henry Clay Frick demanded wage cuts and the elimination of the union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Frick locked the workers out. He built a 12-foot fence around the mill, topped with barbed wire and fitted with rifle slits. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents and sent them up the Monongahela River on barges in the middle of the night to seize the mill. The workers were waiting for them. The battle lasted 14 hours. 7 workers were killed, 20 were shot, more than 300 were injured, 9 Pinkertons were killed, and many more were wounded. The governor of Pennsylvania sent 8,500 National Guard troops to Homestead. The troops seized the mill for Frick. The strike collapsed. The union was broken. Carnegie was in Scotland during the entire affair. He sent a telegram to Frick that read in part, "All anxiety gone since you stand firm." Frick stood firm. The union was destroyed. For the next 40 years, no effective labor organization existed in the American steel industry. Without the union, Carnegie imposed the 12-hour day and the 84-hour week as the standard across all his operations. Without the union, there was no mechanism to negotiate working conditions, safety practices, or the schedule that consumed the men who ran the machines. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was the moment the machine system locked into place. The machines ran continuously. The men worked 12 hours, 7 days, with the turnaround. The smoke poured from the stacks, and nobody who had the power to change it had a reason to. The men who filled the Carnegie mills were immigrants: Slovak, Hungarian, Polish, Croatian, Italian, Irish. They arrived in Pittsburgh by the thousands, beginning in the 1880s, recruited by labor agents, drawn by wages that were, by the standards of the countries they had left, extraordinary. A common laborer at Edgar Thomson earned between $1.50 and $2 per day. They moved into boarding houses and row houses in Braddock and Homestead and Munhall and Rankin, the mill towns lining both banks of the Monongahela River, where the smokestacks were visible from every window and the sound of the rolling mills carried through the walls at night. They shared beds in shifts. The night-turn man slept in the bed during the day. The day-turn man slept in it at night. The bed was never empty. The house was never quiet. The rent was split. The wages were pooled. The family ate what it could afford, which was bread and potatoes and coffee, and whatever the wife could stretch to feed the boarders and the children and the husband who came home too exhausted to speak. Thomas Bell, born Thomas Belejkak in Braddock in 1903, the son and grandson of Slovak immigrant mill workers, wrote a novel called Out of This Furnace that traces 3 generations of one family through the Carnegie machine system. It begins in the 1880s with Juro Krasha walking from New York to the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania because he could not afford the train fare, then moving to Braddock to work in the Edgar Thomson mill. His daughter, Mary, marries Mike Debrejkak, a steelworker at Edgar Thomson, and their lives, Bell writes, were made desperate by the inhuman working conditions of the mills and were held together by the warm bonds of their family life. Mike works the open hearth floor, he works the 12-hour shifts, he works the turnaround. He dies. His son Dobie, the 3rd generation, comes of age. In the 1920s, determined not to be sacrificed to the mills the way his father and grandfather were sacrificed. Bell grew up in the houses where the characters live. He worked in the mills where they work. He knew the turnaround from the inside. The novel is fiction. The machine system it describes is not. It has been adopted for course use in more than 250 universities because it is the closest thing to a primary source for what it felt like to live inside Carnegie's machine, written by a man who was born inside it and spent his life trying to write his way out. Andrew Carnegie sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan on March 2, 1901, for $480 million in gold bonds, the largest business transaction in history at that time. Carnegie was 65 years old. He retired from industry entirely. He devoted the remaining years of his life to philanthropy on a scale that had no precedent. He built 2,509 public libraries across the English-speaking world. He funded Carnegie Hall in New York. He founded Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. He gave away approximately $350 million over the course of his retirement, equivalent to roughly $11 billion today. He wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that the rich have a moral obligation to distribute their surplus for the improvement of society. He wrote the line, "The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced." The machines that generated the surplus were still running when he wrote that. The men who ran them were still working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, with the turnaround every other Sunday. U.S. Steel, the corporation that Morgan assembled from Carnegie's empire and the holdings of several other steelmakers in 1901, continued the same working conditions, the same schedules, the same disregard for the cost in human bodies for another 22 years. The 8-hour day did not arrive in the steel industry until 1923, and it arrived not because the companies chose it, but because a sustained public campaign backed by reformers, journalists, church leaders, and eventually President Warren Harding himself shamed the industry into abandoning the system that Carnegie had built and that his successors had maintained because the machines could not stop and the men inside them had no power to make them. When a steel furnace exploded, according to one historical account of Carnegie's operations in Homestead, Carnegie worried about loss of production, not loss of life. The families of the deceased were not compensated by the company. The machines kept running, the smoke kept rising, the city kept darkening, and the man who owned the machines gave the city a library and a concert hall and a university, all of them built with money from the same system that was killing the men inside it and poisoning the air the city breathed. Braddock, Pennsylvania, where Carnegie built the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in 1875, where Juro Kracha walked to from New York in Bell's novel, where Mike Debrecikak worked the open hearth floor and died, where 3 generations of Slovak families were consumed by the blast furnaces, remains today one of the poorest communities in the United States. The population has fallen from over 20,000 at its peak to fewer than 2,000. The main street, Braddock Avenue, is largely abandoned. Storefronts stand empty behind broken glass. The steelworks is still there, still operating under U.S. Steel, still producing steel at the Edgar Thomson facility, but employing a fraction of the workforce it once consumed. The Carnegie Library of Braddock, built in 1889 with Carnegie's personal funds, was the first Carnegie Free Library in the United States. It still stands, it still operates. It was recently renovated with community funds and private donations. The blast furnaces that paid for it are visible from its front steps. The library and the furnaces occupy the same street. They always have. One was supposed to be the antidote to the other. Both are still there. The furnaces are still running. The library is still open. And Braddock is still poor. I started with a number, 20%. 1 in 5 male deaths in Pittsburgh in the 1880s happened inside a steel mill. The machines that produced that number also produced the steel that built the Brooklyn Bridge, the Flatiron Building, the Panama Canal locks, the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line, the naval fleet that won the Spanish-American War, and the structural framework of every major American city built between 1880 and 1920. The machines made the steel that built America. The machines made the smoke that buried Pittsburgh. The machines made the schedule that consumed the men. And the man who owned the machines gave the city a library with his name on it and retired to a castle in Scotland and wrote about the moral obligations of wealth while the turnaround continued every other Sunday in the mills he'd built, and the men inside them worked 24 hours straight and went home and slept and came back and did it again because there was no other work and the machines did not stop and the furnaces could not cool and the smoke kept rising and the street lights stayed on at noon. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces under 40-ton weights, and sometimes on the casting floor of a blast furnace in Braddock, Pennsylvania, where the pig iron ran white-hot through sand channels and the air shimmered above the molds, and the man working the 12-hour turn knew that the machine he was feeding would outlast him and the city it was poisoning, and the fortune it was building for a man who had already moved to Scotland and was writing essays about generosity. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different, or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the wood screw pump built the city of New Orleans and then sank it below sea level, that video is on screen now.